The metal bucket hit the polished marble floor with a sound that echoed through Westfield Academy's pristine hallways like a gunshot, its contents spreading across designer shoes that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. 17-year-old Maya Rodriguez stood frozen as $500 worth of imported Italian leather dripped with dirty mop water, her dark eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing your life just changed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would shatter every assumption about power, privilege, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating someone whose father had spent 15 years teaching the world's deadliest soldiers how to survive. But Maya didn't know about her father's classified past yet. She didn't know about the medals hidden in his bedroom closet or the scars that mapped stories across his back, like a roadmap of wars most people only saw on the evening news. All she knew was that she'd just ruined the shoes of Bradley Ashworth III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and king of the most exclusive private school on the East Coast. And his cold blue eyes promised retribution that would make her last 3 schools look like paradise. Maya Rodriguez had learned to make herself invisible long before she arrived at Westfield Academy, a skill perfected through transfers to 4 different schools in 3 years as her father chased maintenance jobs that paid enough to keep them afloat. At 16, she'd mastered the art of blending into backgrounds, of speaking only when spoken to, of keeping her head down and her mouth shut while navigating the treacherous social hierarchies that seemed to exist in every school, rich or poor. She thought she understood bullies, thought she'd seen the worst that teenage cruelty could offer. She was wrong. Westfield Academy perched on 200 acres of manicured grounds like a monument to generational wealth, its Gothic revival architecture and ivy-covered walls housing the children of senators, tech moguls, and oil barons. The annual tuition alone exceeded the median household income of most American families, but Maya wasn't paying a dime. Her father's employment contract as head custodial engineer included full educational benefits for dependents, a clause buried so deep in the fine print that most people never noticed it. Miguel Rodriguez had noticed everything during his 20-hour days, maintaining the marble floors and crystal chandeliers that impressed visiting dignitaries and potential donors. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that the same hands her classmates would sneer at for pushing a mop were the hands that kept their perfect world spotless. Every morning before dawn, Miguel transformed Westfield from the chaos of teenage occupancy back into the pristine showcase that justified its astronomical fees. He polished brass fixtures until they gleamed, buffed marble until it reflected like mirrors, and maintained the illusion that wealth could buy perfection. What none of them knew was that those same hands had once assembled explosive devices under enemy fire in places where precision meant the difference between going home and going into a body bag. Maya's first day at Westfield had been a masterclass in subtle social warfare. Unlike her previous schools where hostility came with fists and shouting, here the violence was refined, delivered with trust-fund smiles and passive-aggressive politeness that cut deeper than any thrown punch. The designer uniforms that cost more than her father made in a week, the casual conversations about spring break trips to private islands, the way conversations died when she approached, it all reinforced the same message her tormentors had been sending for years. You don't belong here. The student body divided itself into rigid castes that made medieval feudalism look progressive. At the top sat the old money aristocracy, families whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings, whose ancestors had shaped American politics for generations. Below them clustered the nouveau rich, tech money and hedge fund fortunes that bought admission but not acceptance. Further down came the scholarship students, brilliant minds whose talents earned them seats at tables where they'd never be welcomed as equals. And at the very bottom, invisible to most, sat Maya Rodriguez, daughter of the help, a living reminder that even in paradise, someone had to clean up the mess. Bradley Ashworth III ruled this kingdom with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for anything in his 18 years of existence. 6 feet 2 inches of patrician genetics wrapped in custom-tailored uniforms, he moved through Westfield's halls with the unconscious arrogance of inherited power. His great-grandfather had founded one of America's largest pharmaceutical companies. His grandfather had served as Secretary of Commerce, and his father currently sat on the boards of 7 Fortune 500 companies. Bradley's acceptance to Harvard had been guaranteed before he could walk, his future mapped out in boardrooms and country clubs where handshake deals shaped industries. The cruelty started small, as it always did. A shoulder check in the hallway that sent Maya's books scattering across polished floors while Bradley offered insincere apologies to witnesses. Comments about scholarship students that weren't quite directed at her, but loud enough to ensure she heard every word. The deliberate mispronunciation of her last name, turning Rodriguez into Rodriguez with a drawled emphasis that made it sound like a punchline. His inner circle, consisting of Senator's son Christopher Vail and oil heiress Vanessa Sterling, amplified every slight with their laughter, creating an audience for humiliation that transformed individual cruelty into public entertainment. Christopher Vail brought his own brand of viciousness to the group, his father's position on the Senate Intelligence Committee having taught him that information was power and secrets were weapons. He collected embarrassing details about his classmates like trophies, storing ammunition for future use with the patient calculation of a career politician. His discovery that Maya's father worked as the school janitor became his favorite conversation starter, delivered with theatrical surprise as if he'd just noticed her resemblance to the man who emptied their trash cans. Vanessa Sterling completed the triumvirate with old Southern money and newer surgical enhancements, her family's oil fortune funding a lifestyle that revolved around maintaining her position in whatever hierarchy presented itself. She viewed other girls as threats to be eliminated rather than potential friends, and Maya's natural beauty, despite her thrift store wardrobe, represented a challenge that demanded destruction. Her attacks focused on appearance, commenting on Maya's obviously second-hand blazer or the way her regulation skirt was clearly a size too large, bought from the school's unclaimed lost and found rather than the exclusive uniform boutique that outfitted proper Westfield students. The administration at Westfield operated under the unspoken understanding that certain students required different handling than others. Headmaster Richard Blackwood, himself a product of prep school culture and Harvard connections, had spent 30 years perfecting the delicate balance between educational excellence and political necessity. Major donors' children received what educators politely termed differentiated guidance, a euphemism for the reality that some teenagers could purchase immunity from consequences with their parents' checkbooks. Faculty learned to interpret behavioral issues through the lens of family contributions, with punishments scaled not to the severity of offenses, but to the generosity of annual giving. Mrs. Helen Waverly, the Dean of Students, had witnessed 3 decades of entitled behavior from children whose trust funds exceeded most people's lifetime earnings. She'd learned to phrase disciplinary conversations as requests rather than demands, to suggest rather than require, to remember that parents who funded new libraries expected their offspring to receive treatment befitting their family's generosity. The few times she'd attempted to hold powerful students accountable, the resulting phone calls from board members had clarified her actual role in the institutional hierarchy. Maya's homeroom teacher, Ms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jennifer Caldwell represented the idealistic young educators who arrived at Westfield believing they could make a difference, only to discover that their influence extended only as far as their students' parents allowed. Fresh from her graduate program in education, she'd been hired for her enthusiasm and innovative teaching methods. but quickly learned that innovation was welcome only when it didn't interfere with the careful social balance that kept wealthy families writing checks. She watched Maya's isolation with growing concern, but found herself hamstrung by policies that prioritized donor relations over student welfare. The first major incident occurred during third week of September, when Maya made the fatal mistake of excelling academically in front of her tormentors. Miss Caldwell had assigned a creative writing project about overcoming adversity, and Maya's essay about helping her father navigate job interviews despite his limited English had earned not just an A+, but public praise that made her classmates shift uncomfortably in their designer chairs. The piece revealed depths of maturity and resilience that highlighted the superficiality of her peers' own submissions about summers in the Hamptons and the trauma of choosing between Princeton and Yale. Bradley's response came during lunch period, delivered with the calculating malice of someone who understood that public humiliation required an audience. He approached Maya's isolated corner table with his entourage in tow, carrying his iPhone with screen deliberately visible as he scrolled through what appeared to be a news article. His voice carried across the dining hall with perfect projection. Trained by years of debate team and public speaking classes, "Maya, I was just reading this fascinating piece about immigration policy," he announced with mock intellectual curiosity. "It's amazing how some people work so hard to give their children opportunities they never had themselves. Your father must be so proud that all those years of, what do you call it, custodial engineering, finally paid off with getting you into a real school." The dining hall fell silent with the particular quiet that preceded social execution, every conversation pausing as students sensed blood in the water. Maya felt her face burn with shame and rage as dozens of eyes focused on her corner table. But she'd learned from previous schools that responding only made the attacks worse. She continued eating her cafeteria sandwich, the bread turning to ash in her mouth while Bradley continued his performance. "I mean, it really puts things in perspective," Christopher added, consulting his own phone with theatrical timing. "According to this economic study, someone in your father's position would need to work approximately 47 years to afford one semester here. That's incredible dedication to education." Vanessa delivered the killing blow with surgical precision, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It must be so inspiring for him to see how hard his daughter works to fit in with people who actually belong here. I'm sure he's just grateful that someone gave you this chance, even if it's really more like charity than merit." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel so much as dismissive, the kind of casual cruelty that came from teenagers who'd never learned that their entertainment might have human costs. Maya finished her lunch with mechanical determination, each bite requiring conscious effort, while her tormentors continued their conversation at a volume calculated to include her in their audience. She'd survived worse humiliation at her previous schools, but something about the clinical precision of their attack, the way they'd weaponized her father's sacrifice, cut deeper than the random violence she'd faced elsewhere. The rest of September passed in a haze of escalating psychological warfare that would have impressed military strategists with its sophistication. Bradley's crew had unlimited resources and no adult supervision, treating Maya's destruction as an entertaining puzzle to solve rather than a human being to torment. They discovered that direct confrontation drew unwanted attention from faculty, so they refined their approach into something more subtle and infinitely more devastating. Her locker combination somehow changed weekly, requiring trips to the main office that made her late for classes and earned disapproving looks from teachers who valued punctuality above explanations. Her class schedules were mysteriously modified in the computer system, sending her to empty classrooms while her actual classes received unmarked absences that accumulated toward academic probation. Her textbooks disappeared from her locker only to reappear in bathroom trash cans or the bottom of the school fountain, waterlogged and unusable. The digital harassment proved even more insidious. Anonymous social media accounts appeared overnight, posting photos of Maya with cruel captions that highlighted every imperfection they could identify or invent. Her father's work uniform became a recurring theme, with pictures of Miguel pushing his cleaning cart, captioned with variations of "When you bring your daughter to work day goes wrong," or Westfield's newest scholarship case studies from the best. The post spread through the student body with viral efficiency, making Maya's humiliation a shared joke rather than individual cruelty. The psychological impact was cumulative and devastating. Maya began each day knowing that new humiliation awaited, that her tormentors had spent their evenings devising fresh entertainment at her expense. Sleep became elusive as her mind raced through potential scenarios, trying to prepare for attacks that came from directions she couldn't anticipate. Her grades, previously her only source of pride and potential escape route, began suffering as stress made concentration impossible, and missed classes from schedule changes created gaps in her understanding. Her father noticed the changes but misinterpreted their cause. Miguel Rodriguez had worked double shifts for months to ensure Maya could attend Westfield, believing that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty that had trapped their family for generations. When he saw her struggling, he assumed the academic rigor was simply challenging her in ways that would ultimately make her stronger. He offered encouragement and extra study time, not realizing that his daughter's suffering had nothing to do with coursework and everything to do with social dynamics he'd never experienced. The irony was devastating. Miguel had survived combat deployments in 3 different countries, had faced enemy fire and improvised explosive devices, had carried wounded comrades through hostile territory under conditions that would have broken most people. But he'd never navigated the sophisticated cruelty of wealthy teenagers who use psychological warfare with the same precision he'd once applied to military objectives. In his world, threats were direct and responses were clear. He couldn't protect Maya from an enemy that attacked with smiles and charity galas and parents who funded new gymnasium wings. October brought a new level of sophistication to the campaign against Maya, as Bradley's crew realized that their previous efforts, while entertaining, hadn't achieved their ultimate goal of driving her away from Westfield. They needed something more dramatic, something that would force either her withdrawal or administrative action that would accomplish the same result. The opportunity came during the school's annual Harvest Gala, a fundraising event that combined educational theater with social networking for parents whose donations kept Westfield operating. Maya hadn't planned to attend the gala, knowing that the $25 admission fee represented a significant expense for her family's budget, and that her presence would only provide new opportunities for humiliation. But Ms. Caldwell had specifically requested her participation in a student presentation about academic excellence, and the invitation had been extended publicly enough that refusing would have drawn attention she couldn't afford. Miguel had proudly provided the admission fee and encouraged her to participate, seeing it as recognition of her academic achievements rather than a trap waiting to spring. The evening began with typical Westfield pageantry, with students in formal attire presenting research projects to an audience of parents, faculty, and community leaders who nodded approvingly while calculating tax deductions for their charitable contributions. Maya's presentation on immigration patterns and educational outcomes earned genuine applause from the adult audience, her research thorough and her delivery confident, despite the hostile stares from her classmates. For a brief moment, she felt like she belonged at Westfield, like her presence was justified by merit rather than charity. Bradley had spent weeks planning what happened next, coordinating with his inner circle and several other students to ensure maximum impact with minimal traceability. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening moved into its social phase, Maya found herself increasingly isolated as conversations swirled around her without including her. She'd learned to expect this treatment at school events, but the adult supervision had provided a buffer she'd grown to appreciate. The disaster began innocuously enough. Maya had volunteered to help clear tables after the dinner portion of the event, partly from habit and partly to stay busy while her classmates socialized in clusters that clearly excluded her. She was carrying a tray of dirty dishes toward the kitchen when Christopher Vale appeared in her path with his characteristic smile and apparently friendly demeanor that always preceded his cruelest moments. "Maya, perfect timing," he said loud enough to draw attention from nearby groups. "My father was just asking about the scholarship program here at Westfield. He's very interested in educational opportunity initiatives, especially for underprivileged students." The comment was designed to highlight her status while appearing complimentary, a technique Christopher had perfected through years of watching his father navigate political conversations. Maya forced a smile and attempted to step around him, but he smoothly repositioned himself to block her path while continuing his monologue for the benefit of their growing audience. He was particularly interested in how the school identifies candidates for these programs. Christopher continued, his voice carrying the kind of practiced charm that made casual cruelty sound like genuine interest. "I told him that Westfield really does an amazing job of finding diamonds in the rough. Students from backgrounds that might not traditionally have access to this level of education." More students had gathered now, forming a loose circle that appeared casual but effectively trapped Maya in the center of their attention. She could see adults in her peripheral vision, but their conversations continued uninterrupted as they missed the subtle dynamics playing out among the teenagers. Bradley materialized beside Christopher with his own theatrical smile, ready to escalate the performance to its planned conclusion. "Christopher's absolutely right," Bradley agreed with studied enthusiasm. "It's really inspiring how some students overcome such challenging circumstances to be here. Maya, you should tell my parents about your father's work. They're always interested in hearing about the behind-the-scenes people who keep Westfield running so smoothly." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Refusing to discuss her father's work would appear rude and ungrateful in front of adults, who might repeat the conversation to faculty. Engaging with the topic would provide ammunition for future humiliation while forcing her to discuss her family circumstances in front of classmates who were recording every word for later entertainment. Maya chose silence, hoping the moment would pass, but her tormentors had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. "She's modest," Vanessa observed with mock admiration. "Maya's father is the head of custodial services here. He's the one who keeps all those beautiful marble floors so pristine. It must be amazing for her to see her father's workplace from this perspective, as a student rather than just someone whose family works here." The circle had tightened now, with more students attracted by the obvious drama unfolding in their midst. Adult conversations continued around them, but the volume of teenage voices was rising as participants sensed the approaching climax of whatever performance they were witnessing. Maya felt her face burning with shame and rage, but also something else, a cold fury that reminded her of stories her father had told about staying calm under pressure, about thinking clearly when emotions demanded action. "Actually," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "my father works harder than most people you'll ever meet. He takes pride in his job because he understands the value of honest work, something that might be difficult to understand if you've never had to earn anything yourself." The response surprised her tormentors, who'd expected either silence or emotional breakdown rather than calm defiance. Bradley's smile faltered slightly as he recalibrated his approach, recognizing that Maya's response had shifted the dynamic in ways that required adjustment. The adult conversations around them had paused slightly, with parents beginning to notice the intensity of the teenage interaction nearby. "Of course he works hard," Bradley recovered smoothly. "All honest work deserves respect. I just think it's wonderful that Westfield provides opportunities for families like yours to experience this environment from both sides, so to speak. Your father maintains the facilities, and you get to use them as a student. It's like a perfect circle of institutional community. The condescension was so thick it was almost visible, but delivered with such smooth politeness that any objection would have seemed unreasonable to casual observers. Maya felt the familiar helplessness of being attacked with weapons she couldn't match, her tormentors wielding privilege and social sophistication like armor that deflected any response she might attempt. The laughter from the surrounding students was quieter now, but more vicious. The kind of knowing cruelty that came from watching someone slowly realize how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. That was when disaster struck, not through Bradley's careful planning but through the random chaos that turns calculated cruelty into genuine catastrophe. Maya had been holding the tray of dirty dishes throughout the conversation, her grip unconsciously tightening as stress mounted and humiliation deepened. When she tried to step around the circle of tormentors one final time, her foot caught the edge of someone's deliberately extended leg. The tray flew from her hands in a perfect arc, its contents tracing through the air with almost balletic grace, before gravity reasserted itself with devastating finality. Dirty dishes crashed onto the marble floor with sounds that echoed through the dining hall like gunshots, but worse than the noise was where some of the debris landed. Bradley Ashworth III, heir to pharmaceutical fortune and king of Westfield Academy, stood frozen as wine dregs from abandoned glasses, soaked through his custom tuxedo, and dirty water from multiple plates dripped from his perfectly styled hair. The silence that followed was complete and terrifying, every conversation in the dining hall stopping as if someone had activated a mute button on reality itself. Maya stared at the devastation she'd caused, her mind unable to process the magnitude of disaster that had just unfolded. Adult heads turned toward the commotion, faculty members beginning to move in their direction, and in Bradley's eyes she saw something that made her stomach drop with the weight of certainty about what came next. "She did that on purpose," Bradley said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "She attacked me because of our conversation about scholarship students." The lie was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Witnesses had seen Maya holding the tray, had watched her attempt to leave the conversation, had observed the confrontation that preceded the accident. But none of them had seen who extended the leg that caused her to trip, and Bradley's claim transformed random disaster into deliberate assault. The circle of students began nodding agreement, their testimony coordinated by months of following Bradley's lead in all social situations. "I saw it too," Christopher confirmed immediately. "She got angry about the questions about her father's job and just threw the whole tray at Bradley. It was completely unprovoked." Vanessa added her voice to the chorus of false witnesses. "She seemed really upset about being asked to discuss her family circumstances. I guess she couldn't handle the pressure of being around people from different backgrounds." More voices joined the coordinated lie, each student eager to align themselves with power rather than truth, each testimony adding weight to the fabricated narrative that would determine Maya's fate. Faculty members arrived to assess the situation, their expressions shifting from concern to disappointment as they heard the unified account of Maya's alleged assault on their most prominent student. Miguel Rodriguez chose that exact moment to emerge from the kitchen, having heard the crash of dishes and come to investigate whether his evening cleaning duties had been disrupted by the accident. He appeared in the dining hall doorway still, wearing his maintenance uniform, his presence providing the perfect visual confirmation of every stereotype his daughter's tormentors had been promoting. The sight of the school janitor, arriving at the scene of his daughter's alleged assault, completed the narrative that wealth writes and power endorses. "Maya," he said in accented English, his voice carrying concern and confusion as he took in the scene before him. "Que paso aquí?" The moment crystallized every prejudice and assumption that had driven months of harassment, every belief about class and belonging, and the natural order of social hierarchies. Here was the scholarship student, daughter of the help, caught in an act of violence against her betters. Here was confirmation that some people simply didn't belong in institutions like Westfield, that charity had its limits and consequences when boundaries were crossed. Bradley stood in his soaked tuxedo, like a martyr to the cause of social order, his ruined outfit providing visual evidence of the assault his loyal followers had witnessed and confirmed. Faculty members exchanged meaningful glances that spoke to years of managing similar situations, their understanding clear about which version of events would be recorded in official reports and which students would face consequences for the evening's disaster. Miss Rodriguez, Headmaster Blackwood's voice cut through the tension with administrative authority, honed by decades of managing crises that threatened institutional reputation. I think we need to have a conversation about what happened here tonight. Maya looked at her father's confused face, at the circle of students whose lies had trapped her in circumstances beyond her control, at the faculty members whose sympathy extended only as far as their paychecks allowed. She realized with crystal clarity that everything she'd endured over the past months had been building toward this moment, this perfect storm of privilege and prejudice that would justify her removal from Westfield Academy. The trap had finally closed completely, and there was nowhere left to run. But Maya Rodriguez didn't know about her father's hidden past yet, about the skills he'd learned in places where survival depended on reading situations correctly and responding with overwhelming force when cornered. She didn't know that Miguel had spent 15 years in military units that specialized in impossible odds and unwinnable situations, that he'd earned decorations for actions taken when retreat wasn't an option and surrender meant death. She was about to learn that some people only look like easy targets until you corner them completely, and that the most dangerous mistake her tormentors could make was believing their own propaganda about who held real power in the confrontation they just created. The evening was far from over, and Maya's father had been watching and listening much longer than anyone realized. The game was about to change completely. Miguel Rodriguez had been standing in the kitchen doorway for exactly 17 minutes before the dishes crashed, his trained eyes cataloging every detail of the confrontation unfolding in the dining hall with the methodical precision of someone who'd once needed to assess hostile situations in under 3 seconds or die. What his daughter's tormentors mistook for a confused immigrant janitor stumbling onto a scene was actually a 15-year Special Forces veteran conducting reconnaissance, his apparent confusion masking the tactical assessment that had already identified threats, exits, and the exact moment when intervention would become necessary. The conversation he'd overheard through the service door had triggered memories Miguel had spent 3 years trying to suppress. Flashbacks to villages where local power structures protected predators and silenced victims, where corruption wore expensive clothes and spoke in educated voices while destroying innocent lives. He'd listened to his daughter being systematically humiliated by children who wielded privilege like weapons, and something deep in his chest had begun burning with the same cold fire that had once helped him survive missions where failure meant his entire unit died screaming. Miguel's transformation from maintenance worker to something infinitely more dangerous began the moment he heard Bradley's voice dripping with calculated cruelty, each word designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on a girl whose only crime was existing in a space where she supposedly didn't belong. The accent that his co-workers assumed indicated limited intelligence had been carefully cultivated to make powerful people underestimate him, a camouflage technique learned in places where seeming harmless kept you alive long enough to complete objectives that officially never happened. As faculty members began converging on the scene with expressions of practiced concern that barely masked their relief at having grounds to remove a problematic scholarship student, Miguel made rapid calculations about power dynamics, institutional politics, and the precise moment when his daughter's situation would shift from salvageable to catastrophic. His hands, calloused from years of maintenance work, but steady from muscle memory that came from diffusing explosives under enemy fire, reached into his jacket pocket to activate the recording application on a phone that contained capabilities most civilian devices lacked. "Que paso aquí?" The question he asked his daughter was delivered in the heavily accented English that had convinced 3 years of Westfield faculty that he was just another hardworking immigrant grateful for any opportunity. But his eyes were conducting the kind of threat assessment that had once kept Delta Force units alive in hostile territory. Every witness, every potential exit, every person who might become an obstacle when the situation inevitably escalated, all cataloged and prioritized. With the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation killed good people. Headmaster Blackwood's approach carried the confident authority of someone who'd managed similar situations countless times, his expression already settling into the practiced sympathy reserved for difficult conversations about institutional fit and student behavior. Miguel recognized the type immediately, having dealt with officers who prioritized political considerations over ground truth, commanders who sacrificed soldiers to protect their own careers when operations went sideways, and accountability threatened comfortable narratives. "Mr. Rodriguez." Blackwood's voice carried the particular tone reserved for conversations with staff members, friendly but unmistakably hierarchical, designed to reinforce social positions while maintaining plausible deniability about condescension. "I'm afraid there's been an incident involving your daughter. We'll need to discuss this privately, but it appears she may have had some difficulty adjusting to the social expectations here at Westfield." The words were carefully chosen to imply guilt without direct accusation, to suggest problems with Maya's character rather than the systematic harassment Miguel had been documenting for weeks through security footage he'd accessed using skills the school's IT department couldn't imagine their janitor possessed. His expression remained confused and concerned, the performance of a worried parent who didn't understand the complexities of elite educational institutions, while his mind calculated the precise moment when maintaining cover would become counterproductive. Bradley stood in his ruined tuxedo like a victim of unprovoked assault, his supporters arranged around him with the coordinated precision of people who'd rehearsed their roles in whatever performance they were delivering. Miguel's trained eye caught details the faculty members missed, the positioning that suggested planned confrontation, the slightly delayed reactions that indicated coached responses, the way several students kept glancing at phones as if coordinating their stories through digital communication. "She attacked me," Bradley repeated for the benefit of arriving adults, his voice carrying just the right mixture of shock and hurt dignity. "I was simply asking about her family's experience with the school's community outreach programs, and she became violent. I think the pressure of trying to fit in here may have been too much for her to handle." Christopher Vale nodded earnestly, his political training evident in the way he supported Bradley's narrative without appearing rehearsed. It was completely unprovoked. "She seemed increasingly agitated as we talked about educational opportunities for underprivileged students. I think she misinterpreted our genuine interest as something negative." Vanessa Sterling added her confirmation with the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned that the right tone could make any lie believable. "We were all just trying to be inclusive, to help her feel welcome despite the obvious differences in our backgrounds." Her reaction was shocking and honestly a little frightening. More students chimed in with supporting testimony, each voice adding weight to the fabricated narrative, while Miguel stood silently and listened to his daughter being systematically framed for assault by children whose parents could buy and sell his family without noticing the expense. The coordination was impressive in its thoroughness, the kind of operation that required planning and resources and absolute confidence that consequences wouldn't reach the people orchestrating the deception. Ms. Caldwell arrived with genuine concern written across her face, her idealism still intact enough to focus on Maya's well-being rather than institutional liability. "Maya, are you hurt? What happened here?" Her questions were directed at her student rather than the assembled witnesses, a detail that Miguel noted with approval even as he recognized that her good intentions would be overwhelmed by the political realities already in motion. The student became violent during the conversation about her scholarship status. Mrs. Waverly's voice cut through any potential sympathy with administrative efficiency. Multiple witnesses confirm that she deliberately threw dishes at Bradley Ashworth in an unprovoked assault. We'll need to follow proper disciplinary procedures, which may include suspension pending a full investigation. The mention of suspension triggered something in Miguel's expression that observers might have mistaken for panic, but was actually recognition that the situation had reached the point where continued silence would mean watching his daughter become collateral damage in a war she couldn't fight with conventional weapons. His years of deep cover operations had taught him that sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming odds was to fundamentally change the nature of the engagement. "Excuse me," Miguel said quietly, his accent suddenly less pronounced. As stress patterns shifted in ways that suggested English wasn't as challenging for him as he'd been pretending. "Before we discuss discipline, perhaps we should review what actually happened here tonight, rather than relying on testimony from people who may have motivations beyond simple truth." The shift in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of change that made experienced interrogators pay closer attention because they recognized when someone stopped performing and started revealing their actual capabilities. "Headmaster." Blackwood paused in his movement toward damage control, his administrator's instincts detecting something unexpected in the maintenance worker's response. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you're concerned about your daughter," Blackwood replied with practiced patience, "but we have multiple witnesses to this incident. The best thing for Maya right now is to accept responsibility and work with us to address whatever underlying issues may have contributed to this unfortunate situation." Miguel nodded thoughtfully, his expression still worried, but his posture shifting in ways that suggested military training asserting itself despite years of careful civilian camouflage. "Multiple witnesses are indeed important for establishing truth. Perhaps we should include all available evidence in our assessment, rather than limiting ourselves to selective testimony." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone, its screen already displaying the recording application that had been running since the confrontation began. "I've been documenting interactions involving my daughter for several weeks now, after noticing patterns of behavior that concerned me as a parent. Tonight's incident was captured in its entirety, including the conversation that preceded the accident." The word accident hung in the air like a challenge, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who possessed evidence rather than merely disputing narratives. Bradley's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his composed performance, as he realized that his version of events might face contradiction from sources he hadn't anticipated or prepared for. The phone was recording the conversation that led to the incident. Miguel continued, his accent continuing to fade as the situation demanded more direct communication. It captured the deliberate harassment, the coordinated intimidation, and the specific moment when someone extended their foot to cause my daughter to trip and lose control of the dishes she was carrying. Mrs. Waverly's face went pale as she realized that institutional liability had just shifted dramatically, that what she'd been preparing to handle as a simple disciplinary matter might involve evidence of systematic harassment that the school had failed to address. Text messages, social media coordination, email communications between parents discussing how to ensure certain outcomes from school disciplinary procedures. The conspiracy extends beyond the students to include adult family members who used their resources to enable harassment and cover up criminal behavior. Mrs. Waverly's voice was barely a whisper as she grasped the magnitude of institutional liability they were facing. "How long have you been collecting this evidence?" Documentation began the first week Maya reported harassment to school administration and was told to adjust her attitude rather than expect protection from systematic targeting. Miguel answered with the precision of someone reading from comprehensive files. When it became clear that institutional response would prioritize donor relations over student safety, alternative approaches became necessary. The words carried implications that made several faculty members extremely uncomfortable. Suggestions that their failure to protect vulnerable students had triggered responses they couldn't control through normal administrative channels. Headmaster Blackwood was beginning to understand that he was dealing with someone who operated from knowledge bases and resource access that exceeded anything in his experience managing private school politics. "Mr. Rodriguez," Blackwood said, slowly, "your background seems more extensive than our employment records indicated. Perhaps you could clarify your qualifications and how you obtained access to surveillance capabilities that would typically require specialized training." Miguel's smile held no warmth as he prepared to reveal information that would completely reframe every assumption people had made about him for 3 years. "My employment records accurately reflect my current position as head of custodial services. They don't include previous employment that remains classified under federal security protocols, or training that was provided during 15 years of military service in units that most people wouldn't recognize from public documentation." The dining hall went completely silent as the implications hit home with devastating clarity. The quiet janitor who'd been invisible to wealthy families and their privileged children was revealing capabilities that suggested backgrounds in military intelligence, special operations, or worse, from the perspective of people who'd been treating him as irrelevant help for years. "Classified employment," Christopher repeated weakly, his political instincts recognizing threats that his teenage arrogance hadn't prepared him to handle. "What kind of classified employment?" "The kind that provides ongoing access to investigative resources and legal protections that don't disappear when someone transitions to civilian occupations," Miguel answered with deliberate vagueness that was more intimidating than specific details. "The kind that includes mandatory reporting requirements when evidence of systematic civil rights violations is discovered, especially those involving coordination between wealthy families and institutional corruption." Bradley's face had gone completely white as he realized that months of careful planning had been conducted under the observation of someone with professional training in exactly the kinds of activities they'd been pursuing. "You've been watching us this whole time." "I've been protecting my daughter using methods appropriate to the threats she was facing," Miguel corrected with clinical precision. Passive surveillance became active investigation when it became clear that harassment was escalating toward violence and that institutional protection wasn't available through conventional channels. He gestured toward the scattered dishes that had triggered the evening's crisis. Tonight's incident was predictable based on documented escalation patterns. The coordination required multiple participants, advanced planning, and confidence that consequences wouldn't reach the perpetrators. All of those factors have been systematically documented and are ready for presentation to appropriate authorities. Miss Caldwell found her voice despite the shock of realizing how completely she'd misunderstood the situation. "Maya, are you all right? I had no idea the harassment was this extensive." Maya nodded mutely, still processing the revelation that her father possessed capabilities and background she'd never suspected. The quiet man who worked double shifts to pay for her education was revealing himself as someone who'd been conducting professional-level investigation and surveillance while maintaining perfect cover as concerned immigrant parent. The harassment documentation includes evidence of institutional failure to respond appropriately to repeated reports of civil rights violations. Miguel continued, his attention shifting to faculty members who were beginning to understand their personal liability in the situation. Administrative dismissal of legitimate complaints, failure to investigate credible reports, and policies that systematically protected perpetrators while silencing victims. Mrs. Waverly's career flashed before her eyes as she realized that every decision to minimize Maya's complaints had been documented and would be presented as evidence of institutional corruption. "We followed standard procedures for addressing student conflicts. Standard procedures that violated federal law by failing to provide equal protection for students targeted based on ethnic and economic status," Miguel replied with the authority of someone who understood legal standards from perspectives most educators never encountered. Civil rights violations that created liability exposure for every administrator who chose to ignore evidence rather than fulfill mandatory reporting requirements. Headmaster Blackwood was calculating political damage and media exposure, trying to find strategies for managing a crisis that had already spiraled far beyond anything his experience had prepared him to handle. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Rodriguez? How do we resolve this situation appropriately?" Miguel's expression remained professional but implacable as he outlined terms that would either restore justice or expose corruption to federal investigation. Complete investigation of harassment allegations by independent authorities with no institutional conflicts of interest. Federal review of civil rights compliance at Westfield Academy, including examination of how student discipline correlates with family donation levels. Criminal charges for students who participated in conspiracy to violate civil rights through systematic harassment and intimidation. The demands were delivered with the calm precision of someone who held overwhelming evidence and understood exactly how much pressure institutional authority could withstand. Faculty members exchanged desperate glances as they realized that their normal tools for managing difficult situations were completely inadequate for the crisis they were facing. "And if the school cooperates fully with these investigations?" Blackwood asked carefully. "What assurances do we have that this matter won't result in unnecessary publicity that could damage the institution's reputation?" Miguel's laugh was completely without humor, the sound of someone who'd seen enough institutional corruption to find such concerns absurd. The institution's reputation was damaged the moment it chose to protect predators instead of students. Publicity is the least of your concerns compared to federal criminal investigation and civil rights lawsuits that could result in loss of accreditation and federal funding. He gestured toward the students who'd spent months tormenting his daughter with complete confidence that their privilege would protect them from consequences. These children committed federal crimes with institutional protection and parental resources. Their prosecution will proceed regardless of whether Westfield chooses cooperation or obstruction. But your choice will determine whether the school survives the investigation that's already begun. Bradley's voice cracked with the first real fear he'd ever experienced in 18 years of assuming that money and connections could solve any problem. "You can't prove we did anything illegal. We were just talking to her." Miguel's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to people who'd refused to accept reality. Systematic harassment based on ethnic and economic status violates multiple federal civil rights statutes. Conspiracy to interfere with educational opportunities through intimidation and psychological warfare constitutes criminal behavior under both state and federal law. The coordination with family members to use financial and political influence to prevent accountability adds corruption charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences. He paused to let the legal implications register before delivering the information. That would complete their understanding of how thoroughly their schemes had been exposed. Every conversation, every coordination meeting, every strategic planning session for the past 6 weeks has been documented with professional surveillance equipment. The evidence includes not just student harassment, but adult conspiracy involving parents who used their resources to enable criminal behavior. Christopher's political instincts were screaming warnings about exposure that could destroy his father's career along with his own future. Our parents didn't know about specific incidents. They can't be held responsible for student conflicts. Your parents coordinated through private communications to ensure that harassment continued without institutional consequences, Miguel corrected with devastating precision. Senator Vale's discussions with Headmaster Blackwood about managing his son's disciplinary issues, Mrs. Sterling's threats regarding donation reductions if certain students weren't handled appropriately, Mr. Ashworth's arrangements with board members to ensure his son's behavior didn't affect his academic record. The revelation that private communications between powerful families had been monitored and documented sent shockwaves through the assembled group that went far beyond concerns about student discipline. Adults who'd assumed their wealth and status, provided immunity from scrutiny, were learning that someone with appropriate capabilities had been systematically collecting evidence of corruption at levels they'd thought were protected. Those conversations were private, Vanessa protested desperately. You can't legally record phone calls without permission. Miguel's expression suggested that concerns about recording legality might not be proceeding in directions she'd find comfortable. Federal investigations into civil rights violations and corruption operate under different protocols than civilian privacy protections. When evidence indicates systematic violation of constitutional rights through coordination between institutional and political power, surveillance authorities expand significantly. The casual mention of federal investigation protocols and expanded surveillance authorities was beginning to paint a picture that terrified people who'd built their lives around exploiting systems they'd assumed would always protect them. Miguel Rodriguez was revealing himself as someone who operated from knowledge and resource bases that exceeded anything private school administrators or wealthy families were prepared to handle. "What do you want?" Bradley asked desperately, his privileged world crumbling around him as he realized that months of careful planning had been conducted under professional surveillance by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant help. "What will it take to make this go away?" Miguel's response was delivered with the finality of someone who'd reached decision points where negotiation was no longer possible. "Justice for my daughter and accountability for systematic violations of civil rights that have been enabled by institutional corruption. Federal investigation that ensures this harassment ends permanently and establishes precedents that protect other vulnerable students from similar targeting." He gestured toward Maya, who stood silently watching her tormentors face the consequences their privilege had convinced them would never arrive. "My daughter came to this school seeking education and found systematic harassment enabled by adults who chose corruption over protection of constitutional rights. That ends tonight, through cooperation or through federal intervention that will expose every detail of what's been happening here." The choice was presented with military precision to people who'd never faced decisions where all their options carried devastating consequences they couldn't buy or influence their way out of experiencing. 3 years of careful cover were ending as Miguel Rodriguez revealed capabilities that would completely reframe every relationship and assumption that had governed life at Westfield Academy. The evening was far from over, and the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.